Welcome to the ACIT Science Podcast, the official podcast of the Association for Critical and Interdisciplinary Thinking. We are a global nonprofit organization dedicated to spreading education around artificial intelligence, neuroscience, and social change. In this podcast, we are hoping to provide insightful discussions with young professionals and world-leading researchers alike. I'm your host, Manuel Brenner, and now without any further ado, let's jump right in. Hello, everyone. I'm here with Marcel Schliebs. Marcel, thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, just as a quick introduction of who you are, Marcel, you're pursuing your Ph.D. in social or political data science at the Oxford Internet Institute, and you're working in the Computational Propaganda Project. And to be honest, this is like one of the coolest sounding topics I've encountered in recent years. And whenever I mentioned to friends, like previous to this recording, that I was going to record something with you, everyone was pretty excited about the topic. So no pressure, but I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you. Me too.
So your website says that your research is located at the intersection of political science, statistics, and computer science, and with a focus on elections and disinformation. And I think there are many things we could talk about here. There was obviously just 1 month ago a huge historical election, and 2020 has been intense in terms of global politics and American politics, and just in general in terms of disinformation. So from what I heard from you, you also had a pretty tight schedule and busy agenda, considering there was so much, like your already relevant topic of research became more and more relevant in this intense year 2020. And this kind of computational data-driven propaganda is a global ongoing issue, and the advances of technology also don't make it look like it's going away soon. So there is also a lot of future developments to talk about. But before we get into all of the details, we can maybe start out with some basic definition. So what is propaganda? What does it even mean, and what does it mean to move towards like a computational version of it?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the introduction and having me. I'm really looking forward to speaking. I think in general, the terms of computational propaganda, which has also then been the term after which our project has been named, we've been defining as misleading information and news that is created not only inadvertently or by background research by actors, but intentionally and in the service of some political interest. And then this computational dimension that comes to it, and that can be both in the purest sense algorithmically distributed content by automated accounts, but also by malign users who exploit the algorithms provided by tech platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, and many others to algorithmically distribute content to audiences worldwide across social media networks. I hope that wasn't too complex an introduction.
No, it's perfect. Yeah, so you mentioned these bad actors and this political dimension of the propaganda. So maybe we can just jump into the role these technologies play in the current political climate, and maybe we can start with the U.S. election because it's just so present, and maybe like take a look at a comparison between 2016 2020, and maybe just start out with what happened in 2016 with the Russian interference in the election and how that played out in the recent election.
Yes, of course. I think starting in 2016 and making the arrow to the 2020 election is actually a very good strategy to approach this, because the 2016 election in the United States, which took place in November, and was directly following the Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom, of course, in earlier in the summer of that year, really marked the beginning of more popular, widespread attention to the problem or issue of computational propaganda or foreign state-backed disinformation or or fake news, as it's sometimes being called, um, uh, across the Western world, and that it doesn't mean that 2016 was when this phenomenon first started to emerge or when it was invented. And in fact, you can trace strategies of propaganda back even thousands of years, and they were incredibly present during the Cold War, for example, and then already started to emerge in computational or algorithmic forms on social media um, in earlier years of the last decade. Maybe they were definitely pivoted by Russian state actors in other geopolitical contexts, such as domestic Russia, but also Ukraine. In years before, around the downing of MH17, etc. And then what happened in 2016 was that Russian state-backed actors, with support and backing, has been established by multiple independent investigations, including the famous Mueller report, which had a whole edition on just the Russian efforts to influence and interfere in the 2016 elections. The Russian Internet Research Agency, located in 5050 Savushkin Street in St. Petersburg, which was a really bureaucratic organization with a administratively looking office building, hundreds of people coming in every morning at 8 or 8:30 or so to do their nine to five job. We're operating to influence public opinion around the world, and especially during that time in the United States. So when looking at that, and some of my researcher colleagues, including one of my supervisors who later did an investigation of Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram data of that Russian operation on behalf of the US, I believe, Senate Intelligence Committee. Many of my researchers and also government observers noted a mix of very interesting strategies that can be found in some of those early reports and also in the Mueller investigation. And to only highlight a few of those strategies, one interesting thing we observed was the Russian agents, if you want to call them so, in St. Petersburg, setting up multiple Facebook groups, pages, accounts, profiles, all trying to resemble to be genuinely operated by genuine, real Americans. And these pages were scattered across all dimensions of different ideological spectrums. So you would have, for example, pages being set up both in being like openly white supremacist and racist, and on the other hand, pages promoting racial causes in the name of African Americans, racial equality, racial activism. You had pages for and against gun control, pages related to immigration, to other social issues such as abortion, social welfare policies, whatever. And he saw some interesting strategies, including, for example, these race activism pages often being used to organize real-world protests, to call on the white supremacists to bring their guns, and to opposing activists to come to the same place at the same time to create real-world tensions and uproar. Some bizarre stories of some bizarre confirmed stories of real American middle-aged citizens being convinced by Russian operatives to dress up as a Hillary Clinton double and act as being drawn through a cage in a protest with people shouting "lock her up," and these accounts also being used as something something we called a strategic demobilization, and that means that you had accounts that had previously in the month before built up significant audiences of hundreds of thousands of American citizens, often African Americans, behind these kind of uh, Black Lives Matter, whatever pages. These pages, shortly before the election, kind of swiftly but sharply turning around and, for example, promoting the idea that both candidates were corrupt and that voting either didn't matter or voting for either of them was kind of wrong, and trying to demobilize likely Hillary Clinton voters by kind of talking them out of voting. And there's another very interesting example that I might want to mention as a last example of such a what researchers have described select payload tactic, where a page is really like promoting a very specific cause, again operated from St. Petersburg by a Russian state-backed actor, and just before the election doing a sharp turn to try to somewhat influence the vote. So there was one Facebook page called Army of Jesus Facebook page, which had at its spike over 200,000 followers or likers on Facebook. And just to give you an example, there's like on October 26th, so about a week before the election, the page posted, "There has never been a day when people did not walk with Jesus." 3 days later, October 29th, again, the page posting, "I've got Jesus in my soul. It's the only way I know. Watching every move I make, guiding every step I take." Another day later, "Rise and shine, realize his blessing." Another day later, October 31st, "Jesus will always be by your side. Just reach out to him and you'll see." And then just another day later, in all caps, "Hillary approves the removal of God from the Pledge of Allegiance." And then just another day later, starting again, like, "Never hold anything tighter." So really like trying to build up a page in a long-term strategy, and then just leveraging a couple of days before the election to shout "Hillary approves the removal of God" at these 200,000 followers. And it's a set of really interesting strategies that were shown to been able to reach hundreds of millions of Americans cumulatively over the course of that campaign. Yet it's still an important question and will probably never be fully resolved, how large the effect in total actually was, and whether it was enough to significantly shape and switch the outcome of the election, which is an incredibly difficult question for researchers to address, which we might talk a little bit about later. But so much maybe for the background on 2016 before moving on to what has happened since, and especially during the last months in 2020.
Yeah, just one thing that I also found interesting about this Army of Jesus group is that it's really systematically, they were really testing out a couple of different things that are a crucial part of American culture. I think that page originally started out as a Simpsons meme page or something in that direction, and when that didn't work, they moved onward to other things, and then they found Jesus, and then that seemed to work out really well. And that really, this is kind of the systematic approach behind that.
I definitely agree. It's systematic behind the Russian approach to do a lot of trial error, both qualitatively and also quantitatively. So these platforms these days allow you to do a lot of like tracking what content performs well, do a lot of like implicit A/B testing with different ads. The Internet Research Agency was also highly active in back in 2016 in buying ads on Facebook under a false name, but often in rubles, to try to influence public opinion. And they certainly employed these tactics there, not only on a global sense to export tactics that that used to work in Ukraine to the United States, but also within a country context to try out different things and see what works. Sometimes just trying out throwing in different sorts of content on Reddit, for example, and then using the ones that work best on Twitter and Facebook afterwards and similar things.
Yeah, I think the other important point is that, as you mentioned, it's really not a fringe phenomenon, and it's not like a couple of trolls, but it's really a systematic operation that then went on to influence an election that was incredibly close in many ways. And talking about incredibly close elections, I wanted to transition to the 2020 election that is still not fully over yet. I think hopes for the Trump team are slowly dwindling, but it was still an incredibly close election that kept us on the edge of our seats for a couple of days with waiting for the results in Nevada and Georgia and these states. So what role do you think did these kind of computational propaganda operations play in the 2020 election, and was there a similar pattern to be observed?
Yeah, so we have to note that we're still very much at the beginning of trying to fully understand what happened and who was involved. And if you look back at the time frame and context of 2016, if we go back and go into December of a month after the 2016 election, we didn't know anything of what we've just been talking about for another couple of weeks and months. So we're still kind of ahead of the discovery schedule of last time, if you want so. But we still were more vigilant during the whole process, so know some things at least already. And those things that we know are quite interesting. So I think we went into this election with a huge pressure by both the public, different political actors from different political sides in the United States on both the government, but especially technology platforms, including the big ones such as Facebook, Google, and YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Google, especially through YouTube, to do better this time, to be less less vulnerable, to be more attentive, and to not miss something that significant as in 2016 yet again. And and I find it incredibly hard to judge how well they did if you ask the question like this. Facebook and others, but using the example of Facebook because I know some people there that I've spoken to, invested a lot in trying to do better this time against such foreign disinformation operations. I've heard that some, I think something like 90, not people or staff at Facebook, but different teams within the whole company or something, were working on securing electoral process and something like that during this election. So they've really invested a lot into making the selection safe to foreign sponsored attributable maybe disinformation stemming from places such as Russia. And they've also cooperated, all platforms, all major platforms cooperated a lot with US law enforcement. The probably like would be people like FBI, NSA, and others, to be better at detecting such effort this time. Now that doesn't mean that actors such as Russia haven't tried. We've had some operations that were discovered and revealed in the months leading up to the elections, sometimes targeting the US more directly, sometimes targeting the Western world more in general. There was, for example, one that the people who uncovered it in a report by Facebook in collaboration with a social media forensics company called Graphica, called the Unlucky 13, which was a set of 13, I think, false accounts which tried to promote one false news website that they set up called peacedata.org. And peacedata.org was an interesting operation because, and despite it was the fact that it was caught quite early, was trying to influence Western audiences more broadly in the US, but also, for example, in the United Kingdom by recruiting unwitting freelance journalists, in many cases potentially exploiting the precarious situation that many freelance journalists faced when the pandemics struck and then the economy started to decline. Recruiting them for a couple of dollars via PayPal to write articles critical of US or UK or others' foreign policy, critical of conservative politicians in the UK, even critical of like the more moderate left wing or Labour politician Keir Starmer, and kind of acting as promoting left wing causes. And that operation had a couple of interesting trademarks. It used AI generated pictures to create false accounts to kind of act as the editors of that outlet. But it didn't really have a big impact. It was really caught by, I think, actors, including Facebook and the FBI, in a collaboration before it became a big thing. But it shows that actors, malign actors such as Russia, weren't totally inactive, but maybe to the degree that we know as of now, where we were just better prepared against such threats this time. Now, what that meant in return, however, is probably that by the strong focus on foreign threats, we simultaneously maybe focused too much on them and had a little blind eye on how much of a risk domestic or originating misinformation and frankly like strategic disinformation would become in this election. To maybe sum it up shortly, you had a sitting U.S. president in the White House who unsurprisingly showed tendencies not to accept the outcome of the election, even before it was taking place, and not wanting to commit to its outcome. And I'm saying unsurprisingly here because really in 2016 already, when he won the election, he openly said that he openly disputed the result and said, no, I won more because I won the popular vote as well by millions of votes. And who before the 2016 election also wouldn't commit to accept the outcome except if he won. So it was really, and I was doing a couple of interviews but on election night and the day before, and I'm really not proud of having exactly predicted what happened afterwards, because it was so obvious, and everyone was kind of talking about that fact that in an election with an unprecedented pandemic, people very likely turning to mail-in voting in masses, but the president calling on his own supporters not to use mail-in voting, which maybe they were in the beginning already less likely to. It was in combination with laws that prohibited the starting of counting of mail-in ballots before the election was over. It was totally predictable that Trump would have an early lead in many states early on, and that would gradually then starting to shrink when these mail-in ballots would come in. The president had also been for months undermining the credibility of mail-in voting, suggesting on and on and on the possibility that or the high likelihood in his eyes that they would be prone to fraud. And that's how it unrolled. Exactly all that was totally predictable happened. And the president employing his predictable strategy was going out to this infamous news conference. I mean, that that was so bizarre that it still kind of to some degree it surprised all of us. Saying he won, saying there was mass fraud, which then never could be proven afterwards. But which he to the day continues to claim, and it's going to be very interesting to see what long-term effects that will have. And maybe we can also talk a little bit about the role of platform content moderation, labeling in this process, and why it's so much more difficult to deal with domestic misinformation compared to foreign state-sponsored operations.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting and important point in general, what role these platforms play. I mean, Facebook and Google have been, and Twitter have been in everybody's mouth, and they like, especially our approach to them in the last 4 years, maybe since, as you said, 2016, it dawned on everyone what kind of power these like internet tools can play in the outcomes of these elections. And Trump also using really targeted ads in 2016, and his campaign team really also closely collaborating with companies like Facebook to really personalize ads and to really personally spread information, or probably misinformation, in a really specific and also like kind of personalized way. So and it's kind of an interesting question in general, how we should approach legislation for these big companies for data privacy rights, and what kind of roles they should take with respect to also, in, like as you said, internal misinformation campaigns. So what has been kind of shifting, what has been happening with respect to legislation of these companies, maybe in the last 4 years, or more specifically leading up to the election on?
Yeah, legislation is a very complex issue, especially in the United States, where free speech is a very high valued and even constitutionally very highly protected value. But before maybe moving to concrete measures of potential legislation and what maybe could be done despite the stalemate that the highly polarized U.S. political system may be in if we continue to have a Republican Senate, it's maybe interesting to look at what actually the companies did during this election, and how existing research suggests how effective these measures may be. So as I had described, the platforms were preparing for something that internally they have often called a so-called October surprise. They had been really worried, watching the information space over the summer, that something would come out shortly before the election in October, um, likely maybe in one of the last weeks of October, that would totally shift the debate, totally shift the discussion in a malign way. And in a way, in 2016, that equivalent of the October surprise could be the dumped, leaked, or hacked Hillary Clinton emails to WikiLeaks that were released, and then that really triggered even a measurable shift of public opinion also in favor of Trump, and highly declined Hillary Clinton's trustworthiness ratings, which by many American political science and elections scholars have been suggested to be very influential for presidential election choices, these trustworthiness ratings. So they were waiting for this October surprise, and they kind of shook when they thought they saw a sign of one coming, when this whole Hunter Biden laptop leak thing arose a couple of weeks before the election, shortly before the last debate, I believe. Um, and they took a very different approach, each of these tech platforms. So on Facebook, you had the response of the platform directly not banning the content all outright, but algorithmically slowing it down to hinder its viral spread, at least until its fact checkers would have enough time to go over it and maybe decide on an appropriate label. So kind of to take the turn the algorithmic screw to slow down the spread a little bit. Twitter was much more invasive and interventionist, and really kind of took the almost nuclear option of quickly not only slowing the spread algorithmically, but to for some time hit block users from being able to share that New York Post article introducing the Hunter laptop story, even blocking profiles of people who still were trying to share it some way, and so on. So becoming like extremely interventionist. And thirdly, maybe the third big platform, YouTube, didn't really do anything, and probably was just kind of hoping most people would just focus on Facebook and Twitter and forget there's YouTube. And it's also interesting to see what happened next, because obviously there was a huge backlash from and criticism from Trump supporters and from members of the Republican Party and the Trump camp, who accused Twitter of an information operation of itself, accused Twitter of interfering, of tech platform interfering, using strong language, including things like it's the American people who decide to, or who have the decision to choose their president. We're not run by tech platforms, etc. And I think this background of the October reaction and the huge backlash to Twitter has to be also be included as a context for understanding how the platforms then reacted once Trump started to unleash his incredible lying campaign the days after the campaign, because then we still saw from YouTube high levels of reluctance to intervene. Eventually, I think putting up some labels, but them being very broad about the disputedness of the results, etc. Twitter famously putting labels, but being really incoherent and switching back and forth between the actual wording of them, sometimes saying just like other peoples have claimed this is different, sometimes saying this is wrong, sometimes saying Biden won, sometimes now back switching to something like this is disputed. So really a little bit of an inconsistent back and forth. And Facebook, I think, being even a little bit less invasive and just adding some more general election information boxes or links or something like that. And the question is really for tech platforms, and also regulation, to how to deal with that, because while many Trump supporters or Republicans would say what is happening is already interference and way too much, obviously people from the other side of the camp may say this is by far not enough, that these people are leaving content on there, that they're not deleting it, that they're not being strong enough in saying this is absolute bullshit and lying. Yet on the other hand, these platforms also kind of have to navigate a delicate balancing act, not only legally between kind of protecting freedom of speech, protecting, on the other hand, elections and their integrity, but also navigating the outflux of users to other more fringe platforms. And we've seen that in the US case, for example, with many people migrating to that new dedicated free speech platform called Parler or Parler, whatever pronunciation you prefer, where the platform explicitly advertises on the notion of not censoring, not intervening in content so much, such as Twitter and others, and which start to become a viable alternative to many at least right-wing Americans. And the question, both as a tech company, obviously with a business model, but also kind of more as a regulator and designer of policies, we have to ask ourselves the question, uh, how much do we want to regulate these big platforms if the consequences is losing not only a fringe part of the population, but a large amount to platforms that are totally out of control and deliberately trying to give platform to conspiracy theorists, to anti-vaccination groups and other things. So it's a very difficult balancing act, and I'm very happy to still be a doctoral student to be able to philosophize about all of this and not having to make actual decisions as the responsible policymaker.
Yeah, as you mentioned it, to just put this a bit into perspective of like the landscape of the American debate, because free speech is such a crucial ingredient of what makes America America. That there, like a couple of years back, when ISIS was really big on the news, the original debate around the censorship was really, what precedents do we set if we start censoring ISIS on Twitter, or if we take off these ISIS videos from YouTube. So there was this focus on free speech was so large that, like, really videos of beheadings, for example, it was debated if it doesn't violate like the foundation of free speech in America to start taking these things down. And in that case, it's pretty obvious that that's kind of nonsense, and that the tech companies should act and should censor this kind of content. But when you move on to more political questions and controversial figures on the right, I mean, like this alt-right, or some kind of famous public figures such as Milo or Alex Jones being deplatformed, and a lot of people saying that this is kind of a clear indication of the social media companies taking on like a political stance and really, yeah, taking action against a certain camp, and kind of in this divide of the American society between Democrats and Republicans, really obviously taking the side of the Republicans and of the Democrats, and that obviously participating to the kind of this idea that all media platforms are owned by some kind of establishment, and that then, as you mentioned, like the other half of the country having to find new platforms, and then this kind of echo chamber effect becoming stronger and stronger, because there's literally no overlap anymore in these virtual spaces between one side and the other side.
Absolutely, yes. And maybe to quickly add to that, but we also shouldn't forget, when thinking about dreams of regulating these in the deliberation spaces and communication spaces, and I'm not saying this as taking a position in one direction. I really don't have the gold solution yet, but what we shouldn't forget is that, and empirical studies by my colleagues show that that the use of disinformation and computational propaganda is very salient and being done in Western democracies. But on the other hand, Western democracies are by far the minority of countries in the world. And if we look at the use of computational propaganda around the globe, we see that the majority, even probably, of use cases is non-democratic, often authoritarian countries, where these tactics are employed by governments against their opponents, against ordinary citizens, against opposition, where there's a mix of online harassment through computational tactics, combined with the spread of propaganda and pro-regime false information. And if we think of a gold standard model where the government is becoming more and more interventionist and becoming the so-called arbiter of the truth, that's true, of course, truly worrying on a global perspective. And I'm although I also always end up studying the high attention Western democracies in the end, because there's so much attention, frankly, on it, because there's more data available, because I'm more familiar with the language, etc. And simply, I'm just very, very young, just just starting a degree, and I'm hoping to move to other contexts as well. It has to be noted and remembered again and again that the really vast majority of people being subjected to propaganda online worldwide are not living in Western democracies and are living in regimes where we wouldn't want the government to have any say in how to arbit the truth or evaluate propaganda.
So now I was planning to move onwards to conspiracy theories around COVID-19 and vaccination strategies with a focus on misinformation in European countries and non-English speaking countries to at least get away from the US that gets usually got it was eating up like all of the attention the world had for the last 4 years, or it feels like that. But now, yeah, moving on maybe to that more global perspective of not only Russia being involved in the US, but other countries, other regimes being involved in other countries, like European countries, for example. So maybe we can move to like anti-vax
Sure.
communication or conspiracy theories around COVID-19 and what kind of agendas could be behind that, and which countries are involved.
Uh, Sure. So COVID-19 was an interesting phenomenon because when it first really started to spread in around, say, March and the following months in Europe, it was kind of the only topic of public attention almost by far worldwide, and in Europe in particular. So obviously it was a um, prime target for all different forms of actors to target and pursue their domestic and geopolitical goals by communicating about COVID. I'm going to start maybe because they're often the ones that uh, are the most spectacular operations and um, eye-catching ones with state-backed efforts, maybe by a little bit Russia again, China, but also others like Iran, how they were trying to not influence their own audiences but global audiences, and then talk a little bit about other forms of conspiracy theorists trying to exploit the situation. So when the pandemic was quickly spreading to Europe and other parts of the world, we saw an interesting strategy by state actors from the countries I named to try to influence public opinion really on a global scale and in multiple languages. So what many people, even and myself until quite recently, uh, and many other people in my home country of Germany don't know is that in fact many Chinese state-controlled propaganda outlets, you can really call them like that, that is media outlets such as a news agency, Xinhua, such as a newspaper, the People's Daily, or a radio station, China Radio International, that are often not only funded by the government, but directly editorially controlled by the government, or even often, in many cases, the party itself. So, for example, the German version of the People's Daily is a German language edition of the official Communist Party of China newspaper, that edited by the party, and it operates in German and publishes Chinese state propaganda in German and to reach German audiences. Now, I don't want to make any judgment of how successful that is, and I think it's a still pretty fringe operation. But these editions that the Chinese or Russian outlets have, especially in other languages such as English, of course, but French, Spanish, usually Arabic, have high levels of audiences in other countries such as Latin America, such as Africa, and to some degree maybe also in Europe. And what these outlets did is, when the pandemic unrolled, is to disseminate information that was in many ways in line with the overarching Russian, Chinese, or Iranian geopolitical narratives and interests. So when we did a study of these, both quantitative and qualitatively, in April and June in different languages, we found broadly the different outlets to employ 3 to 4 different narratives and strategies. So first, and especially early in the beginning, there was a propaganda effort in promoting Russian or Chinese aid delivered to countries across Europe, including Spain, Italy, UK, then also other countries such as Serbia and later Africa, Latin America, etc., that just showed how, on the one hand, the Chinese or Russian government were there to help when needed, were there not only in isolation, but were there instead of someone else who did not take the role of so-called global leadership against the virus, and especially alluding to the European Union in Europe, directly contrasting cases in Italy where they were saying, look, the EU let you down, and now China or Russia coming to your help. Rumors of Russian state media paying ordinary Italians a certain amount of euros to thank Russia on camera. One Italian businessman posing for the Russian Russia Today or RT journalists, taking down his EU flag in his company and replacing it by a Russian flag. It was all about kind of presenting them as the benevolent saviors and directly contrasting that to the other governance system that, in parentheses, failed. So that kind of the second narrative that was linked and connected to that was to depict democracy as an inferior governance model that was weak in times of pandemic, and that was not able to protect its citizens efficiently because of its inherent weakness and missing strongness of a central institution of power, and these propaganda theories trying to weaken the validity of democracy, frankly, often and sometimes used real examples from Western countries where governments did make mistakes, such as everywhere in the world where governments were trying to fight the pandemic, but where the free press exposed it and they were the part of the public debate. And that was kind of two important narratives. Then there was one about kind of a little bit less controversial, maybe, about the own response of the countries, probably involving still a lot of censorship, saying how well China fared with everything, how quickly they eliminated all of the virus there, and in Russia the same thing, and bizarrely also in Iran, which had record numbers at that time, but still claimed to have fought the virus much better than everywhere else in the world with some magic machines and medicines. And last but not least, the spreading of conspiracy theories or providing a platform to people trying to convey conspiracy theories. So in the case of Chinese outlets, one of the early narratives they were trying to push was to question the origin of the virus being in China, in Wuhan. So they would, for example, never kind of editorially write a report saying the virus didn't originate in Wuhan. But what they did instead is they either printed or published op-eds by seemingly independent people, but which looked like genuine articles, raising questions about the origin, saying maybe the virus was imported by the CIA or by the US military to Wuhan. That was then followed by a series of reports around alleged US military biolaboratories around the world and raising questions why they're doing viral experiments there and if the virus maybe came from the US biolab. And similar, kind of the biolab was one central overarching theme that united Russian and Iranian outlets as well, who also heavily, quote, ask questions about US biolaboratories around the world in relation to the potential origin of the virus. And in the Chinese case, that continued for months afterwards, not only talking about biolabs, but also every once in a while finding someone who would question whether the virus had already originated somewhere else sometime earlier, finding some mayor from New Jersey who was really sure that his fever back in November 2019 was definitely COVID, misquoting some doctor in Italy who said that there was a strong flu also earlier in Italy, and so on. But these state actors really trying to exploit these narratives for their purposes. And maybe one last example of a clear evidence of Chinese state-controlled media employing outright fabrication of content was the publication of a video which was heavily promoted also by Chinese diplomats on Twitter, claiming to show Italians playing the Chinese anthem from their balconies in Rome and shouting "Grazie China" for their benevolent help, which was later shot to be like editorially edited and fabricated. And in fact, I think neither the anthem was played nor did someone shout "Grazie China" at that specific moment.
Yeah, I think that's a really a good moment to maybe try to disseminate in a bit more detail what the different agendas behind these all of these tactics are. Because on the one hand, you have in Russia the IRA interfering with the US election and really having that pretty obviously implicit goal, as you mentioned in the previous examples, of creating tribalism and kind of creating civil unrest within the US and really destabilizing the Western democracies. But on the other hand, you have maybe in China or from Turkey or the Iranian perspective, kind of this interest of also spreading division and making the West look weak, but in the same way also kind of promoting their own regime, in China's case, to divert blame that the US were pretty obviously giving them for causing that pandemic and for being unable to control it in the early phases. So what do you think are kind of the core motivations behind these propaganda campaigns, and maybe also moving towards anti-vax propaganda and kind of these conspiracy theories?
Yes.
Is it more like from a promotional perspective or more spreading division or both?
Great questions and great points. I think in the past, yes, and sometimes maybe overly, we focused on electoral processes and short-term goals of propaganda when studying and reporting on these things, simply because elections are such high media attention events. Yet, I think in most of the cases, for most of the countries you've mentioned, strategies they have include short-term elements, but are much more long-term and have as a long-term goal the undermining and discrediting of Western alternative models of governance, of democratic rule of law and democratic systems, and for different motives. Probably, I mean, we would go very deep into international relations here, and maybe have to make it a bit shortly. But if you think about why authoritarian regimes such as Russia or China would have an interest in discrediting Western system of governance, then obviously to weaken them as their geopolitical competitors, to to support maybe oppositional forces in these respective countries, but also, and in the end, it always boils down kind of to a large degree to that aspect, also to ensure regime survival of these regimes themselves in their respective countries. Because if they're able to show how weak their systemic, if you want, so competitors are in dealing with different problems, it also helps them defend against potential threats to their own legitimacy. And in years long before all this happened, in the early 2010s, we've already seen Russian and Chinese outlets, for example, reporting on every little protest of youth in Paris putting a few cars on fire, something like that, as a huge geopolitical event. Always trying to kind of promote this notion of how weak liberal democracies are in protecting security and things like that. So I think really we have to take into account and remember that it's both short and long termish strategies that are at play here for these countries. Now, maybe moving to anti-vaccination myth and disinformation, very interesting and large topic, and we also are just starting and are continuing to do more research on that. Here you have a very interesting intersection and an example of an intersection between foreign state actors trying to manipulate opinion in the public opinion and attitudes in the West, and then intersecting with domestic actors and domestic conspiracy theorists, because you have a large community of and very diverse community. We always sometimes say jokingly, including both liberals, yoga moms, as well as um, uh, radical government critics and gun lovers in the United States, who are all highly critical of the of vaccinations and the government's role in them. And who include really kind of unwitting, truly skeptic individuals who have who have genuine fears, that not in the sense that I judge them as genuine, but kind of in terms of process arise as a sort of information result of an information process that where they're influenced by content, where they're influenced by peers. But we don't only have these unwitting individuals, but we have a whole industry that kind of commercializes anti-vaccinism, that monetizes it well. Is it through ads, through selling alternative medicine products, etc., online, and a real like commercial side to it. And then we have foreign state actors such as Russia with a proven record, and there's like peer-reviewed academic publications on that as well, who have been shown to use false accounts, or if you want, so troll accounts online to promote anti-vaccination narratives in Western countries to maybe weaken trust in government. To you probably have to allege them as well of at least risking of undermining public health, and who continued to do so during this pandemic, both to maybe play to this general notion that I described of undermining trust in the government and public health, but interestingly this time also because they are in a direct competition with their Sputnik vaccine, maybe not so in European markets, where it's unlikely that we'll have a high penetration of the Russian vaccine, but much more realistically in other global contexts, such as Asia, India, Arabic countries, Latin America, etc., where Russia seems to be really keen to export their vaccine to, and where content that we're seeing thousands of articles by different language editions of Russian outlets, promoting the brilliant effectiveness of their own vaccine and reporting on complications, rumors, and other things about Western vaccines, might be directed at supporting these efforts.
And isn't the Russian vaccine, also called Sputnik 5 or something? So kind of
Yes,
obviously
yeah,
carrying
right.
that undertones of Cold War propaganda, or
Yeah, definitely has to be regarded in that sense as well.
like something where we brushed across a couple of times already in this conversation is how the technological developments and the shifts in technological landscape have in many ways facilitated this ongoing like propaganda machinery that is being put in place by these different global players. So, as you mentioned, maybe also in the 2000s and the 2010s, there was a lot of kind of attempts or like maybe premature attempts to create this kind of influence on the Western world. But the success of the last couple of years have shown that really the technologies that were needed are these kind of social networks, this kind of easy distribution of spread of information online. So what has kind of changed, and maybe to look a bit into the future, you mentioned the example of these Italian people allegedly shouting "Thanks China," and this video material not being real. What kind of influence will these fake media play in further kind of decoupling these virtual spaces in which information is transferred from any kind of substantial reality?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and unfortunately, I think the result of making that thought will be quite pessimistic or dark, at least on the first hand. So, going a step back and thinking about the role of that social media and digital communication played for this, I think we're now at a point in history where some parts are very similar to say maybe the post Second World War period, and some parts are fundamentally different. And what's similar is that also after the Second World War, we were just coming out of a devastating war. Obviously, we were we were just out of a clash of two fundamentally different systems, fascism and liberal democracy. On the other hand, experiencing the rise of Soviet communism. So really like a clash of global systems, and a starting to focus on media effects and trying to explain why people had different political opinions, if you want. So people started to really focus on the question of um, why did people differ in their ideology, and why did different ideologies arise, both like on the global perspective of these different systems, but also internally. And kind of the early hypothesis of feeling that many people had um, was to kind of mm, directly assume that media consumption and the different forms of information that people consume have a large role on political attitudes and political ideology. And that's somewhat understandable, because as an individual, obviously I have my convictions and ideas, and I believe that they are the result of a lot of rational deliberation and weighing of arguments, etc. Yet I see many people around me having other opinions, both globally as well as within my own systems. And I'm obviously looking to find potential explanations why this might be the case, and with people implicitly believing they're right, and the others just being humans as well. Um, Explaining or blaming it away on their media consumption and saying, look, it has to be kind of the information they consume that leads them to this entirely different conclusion, is something that sounds logical and leads people to believe that per se media effects on an individual have to be highly impactful. And we can maybe talk a little bit, if we have time left in the end, about how science can measure these things. But we had this kind of first evolving of focus on propaganda, on media effects, etc. Yet we were in a highly analog system, and we didn't have digital communication spaces, echo chambers, social media networks where people could communicate. I think in that first dimension, we're now on a very similar situation actually to where we were before where we were after the Second World War. We again have kind of the end of a few years of very consensual politics, where we had kind of both in the global dimension and in many Western countries, liberal, mainstream, central elites dominating the political spectrum in the 1990s and 2000s, centrist, mainstream elites, if you want so, also in charge of major media organizations, academia, etc., and having what many perceived as a quite healthy information environment. Yet, with the end of this consensual model of politics and the rising of populism, of right wing populism, as well as some left wing populism tendencies across Europe as well, with like Mélenchon in France and maybe to a small degree also Corbyn in the UK, etc. We again find ourselves at a very contested point ideologically in political debates, and then therefore again information spaces and different forms how people communicate are again central to trying to understand these differences. Now, the huge difference this time, however, and here we're less similar to the situation from after the Second World War. Now we have these communication infrastructures that are often per se almost perfectly designed to amplify such divisions, to leverage human psychological traits and psychological biases to strengthen and evolve such dynamics. So, for example, I think someone previously has called, I think, the internet and social media the largest machine of confirmation bias in the history of humankind, or something like that. We have a structure where people can selectively consume information, where algorithms recommend them what they believe they would want to see anyways, which obviously confirms and strengthens political biases further. We have conformity bias, where people are conformed in their beliefs by peers around them in inoculated spaces having similar opinions. And we have a situation, maybe as a last point to make, where it's much easier to both in an incredibly cheap way, as well as with high levels of deniability and plausible deniability for different actors, to rely on inauthentic versions of such forms of communication, to use falsely operated under wrong name and false identities accounts, often with inauthentic or algorithmic dissemination, and to do so with deniability and cheaply. And this whole mix has made it already really explosive to create a large effect here. And unfortunately, if we look into the future in a second, we'll see that the technological trends as they're happening at the moment are likely, at least for some time, not going into the right direction to help us there.
Yeah, and I think there has been kind of some awakening, especially in the Western world, with respect to the power these technologies have and this kind of potentially harmful influence they have on our lives. And movies like The Social Dilemma, this Netflix documentary by Tristan Harris, has been pretty popular, and like a couple of keywords like surveillance capitalism, this critique by Shoshana Zuboff on this current system which we are having, where really these big companies intentionally make us addicted to these technologies, and then we are kind of sucked in substantial amounts of our day. We are sucked into these technologies, and within these technologies, they create these really kind of personalized information spaces that really are supposed not to show us any kind of truth or any kind of meaningful engagement, but really to clue us to the screens and to not even drive us away from them by showing us some kind of controversial content, but really creating this bubble of confirmation bias and conformity, as you mentioned. And there seems to be this kind of awakening of conscience around this, or at least we are starting as a society to be more aware of these issues. But looking to the future, there's also a couple of threats on the horizon with deepfake media, for example. So can you comment on how this might be developing and kind of this struggle between us becoming aware of the risks of these technologies, but the increasing power of these technologies making it more and more difficult to really counter them?
Yes, definitely. I personally believe that the risk of deepfakes in this whole issues that we've touched upon today is really large for a couple of reasons. If we look back a couple of years, um, and maybe the very far back to the propaganda in the Soviet Union, you already there saw when the Great Purges started, and Stalin, I think Stalin's KGB employing a whole unit of image forgers to try uh, to forge images of him being on photos with people who he later purged and eliminated to kind of fix history in a way, if you want. So, and this technique and possibility to realistically fake photo images was then later democratized, if you want, so through the rise of Photoshop, and has led to a maybe process where we are today aware that static photo images alone aren't a 100% uncritical proof of anything that they show on them, and that we have some sort of um, level of skepticism learned by now that we know, all right, this image may be forged or faked with Photoshop. Yet I don't think that we have such a criticism yet with regards to video or audio evidence. We still have video footage or audio images that influence global events that are perceived to a large degree as credible and objective evidence. You'd have the 2016 election with the Trump audio tape where he was talking about like the grabbing women by the pussy thing, but across all other different geopolitical contexts, videos taken by individuals on their cell phones still exert a lot of power because they have kind of brought the power of bringing the truth to the world to the individual on its cell phone in their pocket, wherever they may be in some place. Yet the still remaining trust in audiovisual evidence in some sort is kind of it is at odds with the sharp and quick progress we're seeing in the area of artificial intelligence that is using generative adversarial networks and other artificial intelligence methods to create videos of people speaking with the faces of others, for example, or creating videos of world leaders saying things with a very realistic sounding voice as well that they haven't said at all and ever. Um, and that these techniques are, for a variety of reasons, but especially for a couple of technical reasons that would be too detailed to go into at depth here, but through the mere structure of how these models are work and are trained, are getting better and better very quickly, and also in an arms race with people trying to detect them. We get to a situation where very soon, I believe, it will be possible to fake an audiovisual representation. So, for example, a video of a person saying something that will be almost indistinguishable, at least by human eyes, um, from truly that person saying it. And I'm rather thinking at single figure digits, like 3 or 5 years rather than 20 here, until we reach that point, which, if we think through the consequences, would erode trust in another so far considered objective level of audiovisual content, and pursue not only the ability of people to fake false information, but probably as much as that also for people who have actually said something or committed something, to provide them a plausible pathway of deniability to deny what they've done. And I'm 100% sure if the Trump 2016 audio tape had happened in 2026, he would totally have declined having ever said that and just said it's a fake recording, and declined that. And we've already seen cases around the world where such forms of deniability are being used, with claiming that something is an early version of a deepfake video or audio recording. And then we also, in addition to that, have AI generated text and text models. But maybe before moving to that, can shortly continue on deepfakes a little bit more.
Yeah, I think deepfakes, we mentioned in the previous podcast already, kind of this issue between behind adversarial learning with these generative adversarial networks, where really the AI architecture itself kind of makes it really easy to incorporate methods that you develop for detecting fakes. You can just basically then use that method you develop to detect a fake to train your model, to improve the quality of your model, and make it generate data that you can't detect fakes with anymore. So it's kind of the perfect foundation for an arms race of deepfake detectors.
Exactly. It's exactly what I call it. It's the perfect, most purest form of a zero-sum arms race. Because literally, within these generators, the generator and the discriminator are operating in a zero-sum arms race, trying to teach each other to get better. And unfortunately, this also means that whenever we develop technology to try to better detect such images, we also might be helping them to get more realistic, and even get better than a human guessing by chance.
And maybe a somewhat speculative question, but I don't know if you have any data or any perspective on that. But it seems to me that there's this kind of generational shift. There's this kind of cliche of these boomers on the internet not being really aware of that there could be falsehoods in the internet and there could be lies on the internet, and just having a more naive approach towards certain kinds of media, because people grew up in eras where there was, like, media was more reliable in a way. And then could you imagine that there's this kind of shift of a younger generation being more critical when it comes to what kind of media they put their faith in, and then the generation after us, just for them it being completely commonplace that no digital media necessarily bears any resemblance to reality?
I understand the argument, and there's an argument to be made. I think some empirical studies of the 2016 election in the US, for example, showed that older individuals were more likely to share false information or something like that on Facebook, and there's obviously a generational gap, and younger generations using other platforms. But would be far from hoping that the generational shift alone will be anything close to enough to solve the problem, for not only technical reasons, but simply because the shift that I've seen, and the instances where I've heard, for example, heavy both heavy Trump supporters as well as anti-vaccine critics in Europe, in Germany, and other places talk about is that they're not really, my understanding is not really searching for objective truth and kind of coming to an epistemological back to an epistemological situation as in the past where people always disagreed politically. That's kind of the core is a sense of democracies, right? But where both sides had an epistemological shared mutual foundation of how to come to objective truth from observation and facts. And I fear that this is to some degree already gone with many people who don't actually try to find the most accurate and objective information, but who are so deeply embedded into their respective worldviews and ideological biases that even if there's a fact check, a clear fact check, that it won't matter to them. But they say, look, the fact checks are biased too, or they're only fact checking the conservative Trump sides, or maybe this video of Biden falling asleep on TV was fake, but quote, I wouldn't doubt that it would happen, so it really doesn't matter,
Yeah.
etc. So I mean, yeah, I wouldn't put too much hope into the pure technological abilities of the next generation to solve all of this.
Yeah, I unfortunately agree with this. Yeah, not having too much hope in our cognitive abilities. I mean, we are human brains after all, and we've come through a long process of evolution, and there's only like a certain degree of how much we can mold just by shifting environments. I mean, there's much we can learn, but I think we still have kind of this reality bias towards media and believing what we read in text and believing what we see. If we see a video of something happening, it's really, we can rationally decide that it's fake, but it's still hard to get that impression out of our heads. I mean, we also watch Hollywood movies and we can kind of detach, but it's still something that leaves an emotional trace.
And especially if we're exposed to these contents repeatedly many times, there's repetition bias. Then there's kind of an effect where I forgot what it's exactly called, but that very often people remember a certain fact that they read somewhere, but forgot where they know it from or where they read it. And that's often also really dangerous if that source, of course, was a not so trustworthy one. But you just remember I've heard or seen this somewhere, but don't remember where it exactly was.
Yeah, there's I think there's a lot of things to still talk about with respect to that, but maybe we can move towards more methodological questions because it's also kind of interesting how you actually do the research you do and what kind of data-driven statistical methods you use and develop to kind of understand what is happening in this climate and in this landscape of computational propaganda. Yeah. Yeah, so what is it you're developing, or how do you collect your data and evaluate your data?
Yeah. So it's the subject we're studying is a big methodological challenge for many reasons, but it's also a challenge that's interesting to take on. So I'm primarily interested in the effects that exposure to such different forms of unhealthy information, if you want, so online, has on individuals' attitudes and political behaviors. So beyond trying to measure how much there is out there or how much a Russian troll tweeted, trying to really understand what's the effect on individuals consuming that content. And I think this is of course, always you think that your research is important, but I want to make the argument that this question of impact is core to the whole field, because not only is it the direct effects that impact our everyday life and the future of our democratic system, but also that should inform the delicate balancing act that we've talked about earlier for tech platforms and governments about how much to regulate, how much to risk interfering with individual liberties and freedom of speech in order to protect democratic elections and democratic decision making, right? So it's really important to inform that to calibrate kind of that delicate balancing act with scientific information about how consequential the effects are really. And now trying to measure that is unfortunately really difficult for a couple of reasons. First, it's inherently difficult to measure how many people are being exposed to different forms of content at all. In the past, researchers faced with that problem that disinformation was locked in the um, corporate secret drawer of Facebook, Twitter, and others of how many people are actually exposed to some sort of content, always used certain proxies such as the likes of a post or the amount it has been shared to try to infer from that how many people have actually seen it. But it was really always just very broad and unsecure estimations of the actual levels of exposure. We're seeing some first approaches towards getting beyond that. These include an initiative by Facebook that we also may cooperate with in the future that try to provide such exposure data to researchers, but it's evolving and rolling out very slowly. But there's also other designs where some use digital tracing technologies, so people either being paid for by survey companies or voluntarily signing up to install, say, during an election campaign, a browser plugin, um, which then anonymously kind of tracks what sort of political ads they saw on Facebook or what sorts of political content they saw or what websites they browsed and news they consumed. But again, here you're at a really difficult situation because you can collect such data, but you have very strict both legal and ethical standards as a researcher. And I always like to say if I wanted to design the perfect causal experiment for my core research question of interest, the perfect gold standard design would be I take a set of American Facebook users, I somehow target them with ads with completely false and misleading information about a political context. Then I would take their Facebook profile, match it with their publicly available voter record, and check if I successfully interfered with their voting decision for my experimental design. But of course, as I'm telling the story, you already have noticed that this is crossing every at least ethical, I'm not even so sure legal line in the United States, but obviously every ethical red line that you would ever want to try to do and manipulate people's real decision with a real outcome like this. So you're much more limited and have to find alternative solutions, try to maybe voluntarily match people's browsing history with survey data, or find some lucky or clever natural experiments of maybe in some region people had more ad blockers installed or something like that. But it's really difficult because frankly hundreds of different factors influence an election decision, and social media usage patterns are also heavily correlated with individuals' political attitudes and behaviors. And you have these strict data access problems as well as ethical boundaries, which make research in this field really difficult. And I haven't even started touching upon the whole issue of um, detecting sources and forms of inauthentic behavior and inauthentic coordination on Twitter, the huge questions about the buzzword of bots. What is a bot? When is an account a bot? How do we decide that? Can we even ever surely decide it? Or do we always just have to approximate some characteristics of behavior patterns that might indicate um, such patterns? And then once you identify something, to then even attribute it to a certain state actor, almost have to be really lucky, really good, or like be an intelligence agency, which we obviously aren't. So a lot of challenges, but I can report it's really fun and also motivating to see how these challenges are directly impacting democratic processes, and through that um, lives around the globe, and that's therefore a recompensation for the methodological struggles that you have to deal with.
Yeah, and I guess it might be a methodological struggle, but it's like a really important struggle to overcome because this data is potentially so important to know. I guess for not only just from the pure research perspective of really wanting to know what is going on there, but as you mentioned, there's seems to be large interest by the FBI, for example, or the NSA to really understand what's going on because always it's not only about what's happening on these platforms. It might be interesting, but it's some form of Cold War happening or some kind of power struggle going on there. So I guess it's really important to know that. Do you think there's this kind of research also going on in the agencies by the government, and they probably have more leeway when it comes to really pursuing the most ethical paths down there?
um, Definitely, yeah. I mean, I have a little history of working in other contexts, also for governments or international defense organizations. So I certainly know that they're interested in such topics as well. Um, but certainly, you can expect that governments sometimes have other methodological approaches, interests, but again, probably also face some of the similar methodological challenges because they themselves also, I'm very confident, don't get full access to Facebook's database of what users exposed to what content and whether they went to vote afterwards.
Hmm.
But they might have more money to run servers or something.
Is that like one big project you're working on currently, or are there a couple of different things you're looking at?
I am currently working on a paper on Chinese overt messaging, so not like covert operations of false accounts, but on just sort of looking at Chinese diplomats and state media accounts on different platforms and how they were trying to shape narratives around generally U.S. domestic politics, but in particularly also the last election. Um, and then one paper we're writing with a large team I'm leading at the moment is on Russian and Chinese misinformation around COVID-19 vaccines. Some of the themes I've noted earlier, both promoting their own ones as well as just trying to discredit the vaccines being produced and distributed by Western countries. And more long termish, I'm like um, working on these effects questions, trying to design new statistical approaches and methodology to infer effects of exposure to problematic content online on individuals' attitudes, voting behavior, um, and other forms of political behavior and real life actions.
So is it maybe to get a bit into the details? Is it like really a question then of data collection, just to grab some kind of data from these platforms and then really develop the algorithms from scratch to infer some kind of correlations and patterns in there?
Yeah, so data access, of course, crucial, um, and especially with a landscape where people are moving, and not saying that Facebook is going to become unimportant anytime soon, but we see already hundreds of thousands and probably millions of people moving to Parler or Parler and communicating over there, where we're years behind in say building collaborations between industry and researchers, and maybe the will for that will never even be there. But in the case of the big platforms, it's a mix of using publicly available APIs made available to researchers where you can collect data, paired with trying to build collaborations with these platforms, always keeping in mind that you have to find these collaborations in a way that ensures that you can publish your results no matter what they will be. So it's very important to not have to clear something for publication from a platform if you agree into, say, a data sharing agreement, because it epistemologically, quoting Gary King, a leading quantitative social scientist from Harvard here, it basically renders your research epistemologically worthless if people who read it know that it would not have been published if it had to be cleared by a tech platform first, for example. And there's a debate starting and going on at the moment that I haven't dived into it very deep yet, but about this very thing about the freedom of publishing, but within a company, from I think at Google at the moment. It's also very interesting. And then secondly, once you have some data, you always, as I'm not trying to do just replicate descriptive research as others have done in the past, but try to answer causal questions about effect on individuals, I'll probably have to also set up some survey designs that kind of match people's voluntarily agreed, of course, and with very high hurdles of informed consent and through GDPR and very strict ethics review at Oxford, get people to combine their web browsing data with survey responses, to try to, like, both observe what people are doing on the internet and link that maybe also in a temporal structure with their behaviors and attitudes, and maybe run some experiments as well in a separated lab context where you present respondents with different realistically looking content, propaganda, false information, whatever, and understand kind of the psychological processes within the political opinion formation process of how exactly it shapes, what effect fact checks that maybe are depicted below a piece of information have on the credibility of the piece and how it affects the respondent's opinion. So a mix of that combined with some natural experiments, maybe. But in the end, going to be a constant struggle to achieve as much as of a causal claim as you can, while always having to have huge, proactively honest limitation sections about all the potential things you can't measure.
Yeah. I'm now a bit mindful of your time. This has been already incredibly interesting, but we've been going on for quite some time. So maybe to slowly lead this to some kind of conclusion. Maybe on a more pragmatic note, what do you think? It's a very open question, but what do you think institutions like the European Union, for example, what steps can they initiate to further or to kind of get the upper hand or to keep up with these technological developments and this global shifting information landscape? So you mentioned GDPR with respect to privacy rights of individuals, but like more on a kind of strategic level.
I think the EU is aware, at least to some degree, of the issue and is starting to think about what to do. I think just a few days ago, the EU Commission and one of its vice presidents announced that they would try to produce some new measures in countering, especially foreign disinformation. I think, Western governments and including the EU, an important thing they can and should do to counter such foreign state-backed attempts to sow discord and interfere in Western public opinion is to expose it. Adapting from a military context, I sometimes like to call it deterrence through exposure. If you're able to impose cost on an information operation run by the Russian government or by the Chinese government by simply transparently exposing it, you've already to some degree decreased its efficacy. Yet on the other hand, we've also recently seen that to some degree such state actors also like others to overestimate their capabilities, at least. So Russia in the past has sometimes try to create an impression to be able maybe to replicate what they did in 2016 or do even more to scare Westerners and to make them think that a Russian bot is basically everywhere around the corner. So it's very difficult to have a clear opinion there. But I still believe that transparency and like trying to detect as much as we can is a solution for parts of this to deter such foreign efforts. Domestically, it's much more difficult to find good solutions that don't over-regulate and censor and introduce unnecessary censorship. And I think, although it's a huge field and there's no definitive solution, but one important step will be to kind of work together with tech companies to take their concerns seriously, but also not let ourselves fooled by their concerns. Often their kind of methodological concerns of how to best police content and how to best moderate content, not have them interfere with their own commercial and financial interests, and kind of trying to better distinguish there, because here we see that many people, even including from within Facebook and other tech companies, have often claimed that while they're appearing to invest a lot into the integrity and informational health of their platforms, it's still a minor share of their total budget. It's heavily concentrated only in high attention democracies such as the US or big European democracies, often neglecting other parts of the world in terms of resource allocation. And here it will just be important to take the concern seriously with regards to how to best effectively design moderation guidelines and policies, but also take into account platforms adjust legislation to at least the standards we have for analog and print media, and be proactive and ideally coherent here. So if, for example, the UK, the EU, and the US could work together and pull with one pull on one side of the rope here, that would maybe already be helpful, but always remaining conscious of the global perspective of the issue and not forgetting other places with less political lobby or leveraging power towards these tech platforms.
Yeah, that's with respect to Facebook, that's, I think, a very interesting point, because there's inherently a conflict of interest, because Facebook's business model has been so reliant on screen time and grabbing the attention and the algorithms that Facebook uses to maximize screen time by the users, then kind of naturally develop this tendency of escalating the content towards outrage. And this has been much talked about in recent years, but I think Mark Zuckerberg then at one point also said that they shouldn't be controlled by state legislation, because they are the only people that can solve this problem. and that seemed to be a little like hypocritical when looking at the effect Facebook probably had in the 2016 election and their complete inability to really deal with the problem. So I think it's an important point to not be too to kind of force these tech companies in a way to really tackle the problem and not only pretend to tackle the problem, but really in parallel run through with their business model that's not helping in making any of these things better.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, totally agree there.
Okay, so yeah, I think we can wrap it up now. Yeah, it was a really very fascinating conversation. So thanks a lot again for coming on the podcast. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure. Maybe we can talk again in a few years. Once I've done all this, what I described, I maybe want to do and report on some results.
I mean, definitely, I think this problem isn't going away, and your PhD will be very relevant. So I will definitely come back to you, and we can do this again.